All right, so energy releasing pathways. We're looking at the ways in which organisms obtain and utilize energy. So the introduction that we just briefly discussed is that living cells require energy from outside sources in order to perform many tasks, right? So the question is how do cells obtain this energy, okay? As it relates to eukaryotic organisms, we're going to obtain this energy by consuming food. Okay. Plants, on the other hand, are able to harness the energy from the sun in order to make their food in a process known as photosynthesis. Okay. So we're looking at two energy acquiring and utilization processes here. Okay. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration. All right, write those two terms down. These are the two processes in which we acquire and further utilize energy to fuel processes. Okay, and we know that when we speak of energy, we're talking about energy in the form of ATP. That's the storage form of energy in our bodies or in living things. ATP. So most organisms make ATP by breaking down glucose and other organic substances. And so this glucose is going to be found in those carbohydrates. Remember a few chapters back, we talked about the biological molecules, the macromolecules that we need for life, those carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. This is the source of the glucose molecules here that we're going to look at today. Where do these glucose molecules come from? Those carbohydrates. That's our major source of energy. Those glucose molecules are coming from those carbs, okay? And glucose is going to be our preferred energy source. So when we're looking at these processes over the next few slides, we're talking about glucose as the source for this ATP that we're going to retrieve, all right? So this process is called cellular respiration. So there are two other points that I want to make here in terms of cellular respiration. We already said that this is taking place in eukaryotic organisms as the means by which it obtains energy. We consume foods. Our bodies have to go through a process known as cellular respiration in order to break this food down. So the next point I want to make is, where does this take place in the cell? This process takes place, most of the ATP is going to be produced in the mitochondria, okay? In the mitochondria, all right? And we're going to get the production of those ATP molecules, all right? And this ATP is the energy that's going to be responsible for powering cellular activity. So all of the things that's going on in the cell, any processes require an input of energy, all right? So collectively, we refer to all of the processes that take place in our bodies and all of the chemical reactions. We know that our bodies are constantly undergoing chemical reactions all day long, and cellular respiration is one of those, okay? So we use the term metabolism to refer to the series of chemical reactions that take place in a cell, okay? So all of the activity, all of the chemical reactions that are going on in our bodies are collectively referred to as metabolism, all right? We're clear that metabolism is one of those requirements for life. This was in our first early lecture. We talked about that list of characteristics of life, being able to reproduce, being able to metabolic activity, containing cells, maintaining homeostasis. Metabolism was in that lineup, okay? Metabolic activity is a requirement for life. And so there are two types of metabolism, okay? Metabolism is sort of that general terms that refers to all of the chemical reactions that take place in our bodies. But if we wanted to be a little bit more specific and identify whether these chemical reactions are building or synthesizing new molecules, then we refer to that type of metabolism as anabolism. So write down the term anabolism. Anabolism refers to those chemical reactions that synthesize or make or build up new molecules. Those are anabolic processes. Anabolism, chemical reactions that synthesize or build up or make new products. There's a type of metabolism. In contrast, we also have those chemical reactions that break down substances, break down large molecules into more smaller, more usable forms. Those types of metabolism are referred to as catabolic activity, catabolic pathways, catabolism. The series of chemical reactions that lead to the breakdown or reduction of molecules into smaller products. And so we're looking today, what we're looking at with cellular respiration, this is a catabolic pathway, because we're talking about how we take those glucose molecules in those carbohydrates that we consume, and how do we break those glucose molecules down in order to have an output of energy. That is a catabolic pathway today. So make a note of that. If I asked you to identify this process of cellular respiration as catabolic or anabolic, you should tell me that it's catabolic, because we're breaking this glucose molecule down in order to harness the energy within. Okay, so these catabolic pathways are basically going to be the way by which we yield energy by breaking down organic substances. Again, so these can be a number of things. It's basically food that we consume. We can consume carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. Any number of organic substances can be used as a source for breaking down to obtain energy. Okay, but our preferred source are going to be these carbohydrates, because we want that glucose molecule. Okay, it's going to break down to yield the most number of ATP molecules for us. Okay, so we want those glucose molecules. Okay, but in your notes, make sure you're clear that catabolic pathways help us to obtain energy by breaking down organic substances, the foods that we eat. Okay, so we're going to look at two catabolic pathways today that lead to the production of ATP. The first one is cellular respiration. This process is also referred to as aerobic respiration. Write that down. Aerobic respiration is a form of cellular respiration that leads to the production of ATP from breaking down glucose molecules. Aerobic respiration.
Can you just repeat that as a form?
We're looking at two types of catabolic pathways that lead to the production of ATP. One of those is aerobic respiration, which is also referred to as cellular respiration.
But what did you say, aerobic what was your definition for aerobic respiration?
Is the way in which we obtain ATP from breaking down glucose. It's the process of breaking down glucose molecules in order to release ATP.
Okay. So, okay.
Okay. The other pathway that we'll look at is fermentation. This process happens a little bit differently, and we'll talk about it in just a second. But the main thing that we're looking at first is this process of aerobic respiration. In your notes, indicate that this process of aerobic respiration or cellular respiration breaks down glucose in a series of steps. This process happens in eukaryotic organisms. Eukaryotic organisms utilize cellular respiration to break down glucose okay? And with the end goal of producing ATP molecules. Okay, so we're essentially trying to convert the biochemical energy that's found in our foods into these usable energy form, ATP. Okay, so as this name suggests, aerobic respiration requires oxygen. Okay, so let's look at the chemical reaction for cellular respiration. Remember I said these are chemical reactions that are taking place in our bodies. We represent what happens in a chemical reaction by a chemical equation. Okay, chemical equations have two components. We have some things happening on the left and we have some things happening on the right. The things that are happening on the left are going to be our reactants that are being involved in this chemical reaction. Okay, oxygen and glucose. Okay, we have oxygen is required for cellular respiration, and then those glucose molecules are our starting point. Okay, so oxygen plus glucose will yield carbon dioxide. Okay, we know that we breathe out carbon dioxide just because we exist. Carbon dioxide, water as a byproduct, and then energy in the form of ATP will be produced. Okay, so you should be familiar and have in your notes the chemical equation that represents what happens during cellular respiration. Okay, if you just think intuitively about what happens with your body daily, you're breathing in oxygen to survive, you're consuming food, so those glucose molecules are the starting point. Okay, and in turn, as a result of these catabolic pathways that are taking place, the breakdown of those glucose and oxygen molecules are going to lead to the production of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. What questions do we have about that? Any questions? Okay, so visually, what's happening? This is just a visual representation of the process of cellular respiration. This is what's going on in our bodies throughout the day at any given moment. So we have, an individual here. We're breathing in air, right? Air is a requirement for us to stay alive. We're consuming foods daily. Okay, those foods that we eat contain glucose. All right, those glucose molecules are going to be broken down, and the byproducts or the final products of cellular respiration are going to be carbon dioxide, water, and this release of energy into the body. All right. So aerobic respiration or cellular respiration takes place over 3 stages. Okay, write these 3 stages down. Okay, so the process in which we're breaking down our foods in order to release that energy is going to happen over 3 stages. Okay, those 3 stages are called glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. Okay, these are chemical processes that are taking place as we break down those glucose molecules that we just consumed in food. So the process of aerobic respiration takes place over 3 stages. The first stage is glycolysis. The next phase is citric acid cycle. And then the third one is the electron transport chain. And so in addition to grabbing those 3 stages, we want to pay attention into the intracellular location of these processes. Where does it take place in the cell? Okay, and if you recall back in the chapter where we talked about the tour of the cell, we identified the mitochondria as the place for ATP production, okay? So majority of the ATP molecules that are generated from aerobic respiration are produced in a mitochondria, okay? But there's also the cytoplasm, okay? This process starts out in the cytoplasm of the cell with glycolysis, okay, phase 1. Okay, and then it continues in the mitochondria where the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain takes place. Okay, so in your notes, make sure that you've noted these two important things. One, that cellular respiration occurs over 3 stages. Okay, those 3 stages are glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. The cellular locations for where these stages take place, glycolysis takes place out in the cytoplasm of the cell, right? And that's just the internal compartment of the cell, okay? The cytoplasm, that's where glycolysis takes place. And then the remaining 2 stages of cellular respiration are going to take place inside of the mitochondria. And so I'll just stop here to say that when you work on your homework assignment tonight and you're reading through your dynamic study modules, you're going to see a lot more information. I'm giving you a very condensed version of what's happening because I think you need to focus again on the big picture here. There are a lot of details. There are a lot of other players that you're going to see here as you look through and do some readings. You're going to see about the other NADHs and FADs and all the other players in this process, but I think it's more important that you get the big picture here of what's happening and why and what are the products, okay, as opposed to getting bogged down into every single detail of the process. Okay, so I'm charging you with understanding what is aerobic respiration or cellular respiration. What is this process? Why is it necessary?
Okay.
Where does it take place in the cell? What are the products being made? Okay, so we're looking for some key pieces of information. We want you to be able to identify the 3 stages of aerobic respiration. We want you to be able to tell us intracellularly where do they take place. And then I want you to be able to tell me how much ATP is being produced at each stage. Okay, there's from the breakdown of 1 glucose molecule, there is a theoretical yield of ATP in when it's the most efficient. When this process happened at its most optimal and most efficient manner, we're going to have a set number of ATPs being produced at each stage, okay? And I do want you to know what's happening at each stage.
I missed the first 9 slides. Are you gonna put these on Canvas tonight?
I am, okay. And I'm also recording, so you'll be able to get the audio with it.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Okay, so let's keep going. So just in summary, before we keep going, we're talking about aerobic respiration. This is a process, Nicole, in how we obtain energy. How do organisms obtain energy? Okay, and in our earlier slides, we identified that this takes place in eukaryotic organisms. Okay, the way that we obtain energy is through consumption of foods. So we're looking at the process in which our bodies are breaking down the foods that we eat. Okay, particularly those carbohydrates are serving as an energy source for us in order to obtain energy. All right, so we're breaking down those glucose molecules in our foods, Nicole. And so the first step in that, and so that process is called aerobic respiration or cellular respiration. The first step in that process, that's a 3-stage process of breaking down that food in order to get energy. The first step is called glycolysis. Okay, glycolysis is the first stage of aerobic respiration. And what happens is that glucose molecule is broken down into an intermediate molecule known as pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Okay, I do want you to know that during cellular respiration, glucose is broken down to an intermediate molecule that we'll just call pyruvate. Okay, and as a result of that first stage, we're going to get 2 molecules of ATP being produced. I do want you to know that. After the first step in glycolysis, the first step in the cellular respiration is glycolysis, and 2 molecules of ATP are generated at that step. Okay. The next step in that process now is this process is now taking place. Also, glycolysis is taking place in the cytoplasm. Okay. The next step in this phase is the citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle, takes place inside of the mitochondrion. Okay. It's also going to release 2 molecules of ATP. And then the third most efficient process for generating ATP is the electron transport chain. Okay, this process takes place also inside of the mitochondria, and it's going to yield 34 molecules of ATP for a total of 36 between these 2 molecules of ATP, these 2 processes. All right, so step 1, cellular respiration. The first stage of cellular respiration is called glycolysis. Write that down if you haven't done so already. This is just a recap of what I just showed you in those figures. The first step of aerobic respiration is glycolysis. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. This process requires an input of energy in order to get started. So as you do your reading through your modules, you're going to start to see the term net energy yield, net energy production. That's because there's energy also being used. So as you're reading and getting an understanding for how many ATP molecules are being made at each step, you have to consider that energy is also being used. So we're concerned with our net energy production, okay? Glycolysis as the first step of cellular respiration does not require an input of oxygen. You do need to know that, because as we continue to move through that pathway, there's going to be a requirement for oxygen. Okay, but as we get started, this process does not require oxygen at the stage of glycolysis. But in order for those last 2 stages that take place in the mitochondria, in order for those to take place, it's going to require the presence of oxygen. Okay, and so we're saying that glycolysis results in a net yield of 2 ATP molecules. That's what you need to know.
Can you say that one more time, please?
That glycolysis requires no oxygen is utilized at this first step. But in order for cellular respiration to continue on into the mitochondria, there has to be oxygen present.
Okay.
All right. So let's keep going. That's glycolysis. Let's look at this schematic right here. And do not get overwhelmed looking at it. Just follow me, okay? This gray portion right here represents the inside of the cell, okay? This whole gray part is the inside of the cell. This line right here represents the cell membrane, right? We already talked about this structure of the cell membrane, how it separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell, okay? Which is this peach orange area. Okay, and so this glucose, so we've eaten some food, our bodies are now trying to break down and process this glucose in order to get energy. So glucose is external right now to the cell, and it has to cross the cell membrane. All right, we've talked about ways in which we get things across the cell membrane. We talked about, you know, forms of passive and active transport, diffusion, osmosis. We've talked about that already. So we're looking to get this glucose into the cell so that we can break it down for more energy. So glucose enters the cell, cellular respiration begins out here in the cytoplasm, okay? The first step is glycolysis, okay? Glycolysis is gonna be the initial step in the breakdown of glucose in order to get energy, okay? How many ATP molecules are gonna be produced as a result of glycolysis?
2.
2, okay? 2 molecules of ATP are produced from glycolysis. And then I said that there's going to be, and so we're breaking down that glucose now, all right? And so an intermediate molecule is going to be created that we call pyruvate. You do need to have that in your notes, all right? Because this is next going to be the rate limiting step to determine if this process will continue as cellular respiration or if it will go into a fermentation process, okay? Right now we're talking about cellular respiration. We said it occurs over 3 stages. The first stage is glycolysis. Pyruvate acid is made as an intermediate molecule, and then in the presence of oxygen, the 2 final stages of aerobic respiration takes place where?
In the mitochondria?
In the mitochondria.
Mitochondria,
Okay?
I'm sorry, I
So
pronounced
we
it.
have the Krebs cycle, the TC, that's the thing, this name of this cycle changes depending on what literature you're using, but it can be either the citric acid cycle, the TCA cycle, or the Krebs cycle. It's all the same. So the citric acid cycle takes place, and then the electron transport cycle system takes place. And we end up with a very healthy production of ATP being produced here. So again, I'm going to walk you through these steps really quickly. Again, I don't want you to get all caught up in the all the NADHs and FAD, because it's honestly it's important. Everything is important, but it's not as important as just understanding what's happening conceptually. Okay, so you've eaten some food, and we need to break down these glucose molecules. All right. Glycolysis is going to be the first step of cellular respiration, the attempt to break down these glucose molecules for energy production. The first step is going to yield us a very little ATP. We're going to get 2 molecules of ATP being produced from glycolysis. That glucose is broken down into a substance that we'll call pyruvate. And then in the presence of oxygen, if oxygen is present in the cell at this moment, the cellular respiration will continue with the citric acid cycle and the electron transport system, where there's an even more abundant production of ATP being made, okay? And so those final stages of aerobic respiration after glycolysis takes place, and remember, you have to be able to identify these intracellular locations for me, all right? Glycolysis is taking place out in the cytoplasm. After that takes place, the remaining 2 stages are completed in the mitochondria, okay? So the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain takes place, and we end up with a total net yield of 36 ATP per 1 glucose molecule during cellular respiration. That is what you need to know. All right. What questions do we have? All right. So again, this is just a summary, again, of what we just looked at in text, that aerobic respiration takes place across 3 stages: glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport system. During glycolysis, the glucose starts to be broken down, and the pyruvic acid is the first intermediate molecule that's made during that breakdown. Glycolysis is going to yield a net production of 2 molecules of ATP. The process continues into the mitochondria. We have the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain that are each going to produce respectively 2 and 34 ATP molecules being produced for a net of 36 ATP molecules being made. So, I'm sorry, 32. So the final stages of aerobic respiration take place in the mitochondria. The citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle yields 2 ATP molecules, all right? And the electron transport chain yields 32 ATP molecules. And then we can't forget about the 2 that were made during glycolysis. And so we have collectively, we're making a total of 36 ATP molecules from 1 molecule of glucose. Okay, so again, follow me. Glycolysis is going to yield us 2 molecules of ATP. The Krebs cycle is going to yield 2 molecules of ATP. And then the electron transport chain will yield us 32 molecules of ATP for a grand total of 36 net molecules of ATP from 1 molecule of glucose. So aerobic respiration is the process in which glucose is broken down to yield a total of 36 ATP molecules from 1 glucose.
Can you go back up to that other slide, the one with the, I was going to say something before you moved on. Yeah.
Sure.
Could you go over that just one more time?
Yep. All right, so I'll start out here outside the cell. So this inside the cell is, okay, so the internal compartment is here in gray. Outside of the cell is represented by this kind of peach orange atmosphere, okay? And then we have the cell membrane, okay? So we're talking right now about aerobic respiration. This is the process in which we break down the foods that we eat in order to get energy. So this first arrow is representing glucose entering the cell, okay? And this glucose is gonna be the preferred source for energy. So we want to break down glucose. So glucose enters the cell, and the first stage of cellular respiration is glycolysis, right? So we're saying that cellular respiration takes place across 3 stages. The first stage is glycolysis. This is our first step in breaking down glucose, okay? The first step of breaking down glucose is glycolysis, and it's going to yield just a little bit of energy, 2 molecules of ATP, okay? And so that process of breaking down glucose, when we first begin to break it down, we're gonna make a substance known as pyruvate or pyruvic acid, okay? And so then I mentioned earlier before you got on, Nicole, that this process can either take place in the presence of oxygen or
without oxygen.
Or without oxygen. When oxygen is absent, and we're getting ready to get to that in the next few slides, cellular respiration will not continue, but a process known as fermentation starts, okay? So we're looking now in an oxygen-rich environment. When oxygen is present, so we have glycolysis, we started to break down that glucose, we made pyruvate. When oxygen is present, then the rest of cellular respiration will take place inside of the mitochondria. Okay, and those last 2 stages are going to be the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Okay, they're both going to generate some energy for us. Okay, the TCA or Krebs cycle is going to generate 2 molecules of ATP, but the electron transport chain is the most efficient process for generating energy, and it's going to generate those 32 molecules of ATP. And so then I showed you this kind of summation slide right here, where from glycolysis, which is that first step right here, we're going to get our 2 molecules of ATP. And this is taking place out in the cytoplasm. And then in the presence of oxygen, okay, that pyruvate will move that process on. The processes will continue breaking down pyruvate into to get our final yields of energy production in the mitochondria. And the Krebs cycle will yield us 2 more molecules of ATP. And then the electron transport chain will be the most efficient process for generating the most ATP here. And that's what this slide is showing us. And this is what happens in the presence of oxygen, okay? Now that story is gonna end a little bit differently when oxygen is not available, okay? And so we say, so we call cellular respiration, we call it aerobic respiration. Aerobic means that it requires oxygen, okay? But then that process is called anaerobic respiration in the absence of oxygen. That prefix "an" means without. So we just looked at aerobic right here. This word aerobic indicates that this process requires oxygen for completion, okay? Now it can start without oxygen, but it will not be able to finish and create those 36, those other 34 molecules without oxygen being present. So does that bring you up to speed, Nicole?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we're clear on what happens when we're trying to break down glucose and we have oxygen present. Now let's look to see what happens to this pathway in the absence of oxygen. So instead of cellular respiration occurring, a process known as fermentation takes place in the absence of oxygen. So you do have some checkpoint questions in this PowerPoint that you will work on for homework as well as your mastering. We'll come back to that. So let's look at anaerobic respiration. Write down this term, anaerobic respiration. This prefix "an" means without. Anaerobic, without oxygen. What happens when there's no oxygen present? How do organisms get the energy that they need? There's a process known as fermentation that takes place. So this process is utilized mostly by prokaryotic organisms, okay? We said that aerobic respiration was utilized by eukaryotic organisms. So, in the absence of oxygen, cells generate ATP through a process known as glycolysis and fermentation. Okay, now we saw glycolysis in our cellular respiration process, and that's how they all start out the same. Okay, those initial steps of breaking down glucose are going to be the same whether oxygen is available or not. So glycolysis is not oxygen dependent, but once we move past glycolysis, okay, and that pyruvate is made, okay, now we are going to have to see if oxygen is available, then cellular respiration continues. If oxygen is absent, the process turns into fermentation. So in the absence, so we're saying here in your notes, you should understand that in the absence of oxygen, things are going to change a little, okay? Cells are going to generate their ATP through glycolysis and fermentation. Fermentation is the breakdown of carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen. So your point of comparison here in terms of pathways would be the comparison between cellular respiration, okay, and fermentation. Cellular respiration is the breakdown of carbohydrates in the presence of oxygen, okay? Fermentation is the breakdown of these carbohydrates in the absence of oxygen.
So that's like when they like fermentate, like wine or something,
yes,
like when they put something like in a bottle or something.
Yes, ma'am. That is exactly what it is. So we exploit those properties of bacteria and yeast and so forth that undergo these fermentation processes to make cheese, beer, wine, bread, all of those things. Yep. And I do have a slide about that in just a second, Nicole. But yes, ma'am. That's what happens. So we're comparing anaerobic and aerobic respiration. What's happening here? Anaerobic respiration takes place in the absence of oxygen, and it also occurs out in the cytoplasm. Now, why else do we know that to be true when we just take into account the types of organisms that utilize anaerobic respiration? I said that this mainly takes place in prokaryotes, okay? So prokaryotic organisms don't have mitochondria. Okay, so those bacteria don't have mitochondria. So this whole process of fermentation is taking place out here in the cytoplasm. All right, make a note of that. All right, so anaerobic respiration takes place in the absence of oxygen out in the cytoplasm. Now, this process does not produce as much ATP, so it's not considered to be an efficient process for energy production. But again, when you consider the types of organisms that utilize this pathway, it starts to make more sense. Prokaryotic organisms, those bacteria, they're very small, they're very simple, they're not complex, they don't have stringent, large energy requirements. And so those organisms don't need as much ATP being produced. Okay, so they don't need those 32 molecules of ATP that are produced in the mitochondria in eukaryotic organisms. Okay, so anaerobic respiration is a process that, again, those prokaryotic organisms are using to for energy production, but it doesn't produce as much. Okay, anaerobic respiration is going to lead to a net yield of only 2 ATP molecules per glucose, and that's going to be those 2 molecules of ATP that are generated during glycolysis. I'm going to bounce back to our slide here. And again, the process starts out the same. Glucose enters the cell and our bodies are wanting to break that glucose down. So we start with glycolysis. And we're saying that this is not an oxygen dependent reaction right here. Okay, so glycolysis will be able to commence whether there's oxygen present or not. And we get our 2 molecules of ATP being produced. And we get that new substance being made, pyruvic acid. So in the absence of oxygen, that pyruvate will then shift into a pathway known as fermentation, and the products will change. Okay, there are 2 different types of fermentation. There's lactic acid fermentation, where the product that's made is lactate, and then there's alcohol fermentation, which Nicole, you mentioned earlier, where the products are ethanol being produced. Okay, so let's continue to look at what's happening during anaerobic respiration. So we're saying that it takes place in the cytoplasm, but not as much ATP is being produced. In fact, the only energy that's being produced during anaerobic respiration are those 2 molecules of glucose. Those 2 molecules of ATP that are made from glycolysis. So fermentation looks like this. Glycolysis is the first step. Okay, we're going to get those 2 molecules of ATP being made during glycolysis. Okay, and this process actually provides enough energy for most of the single-celled organisms that utilize this process for energy production. Okay, so these are single-celled anaerobic organisms. Okay, and so because oxygen is not available, those final stages will not be cellular respiration, but it will be fermentation. Okay, in your notes, you need to understand that there is no more energy being produced during fermentation. Okay, so the products of fermentation are not ATP.
So is the reason that the other one has 36, is it because that it has oxygen, or?
Well, the pathway leads, when oxygen is present, it's going to influence the pathway to go into cellular respiration versus fermentation, because oxygen is available.
Okay.
And so physiologically, like in your body, right? So just think, when you exercise, right? And you're like, you ever felt your muscles like start to burn when you're exercising? Mm-hmm. That's due to the depletion of oxygen in your muscles. And so you start to feel this pain. That's because your body is now producing lactic acid as opposed to energy, because you've spent, there's no oxygen present. So cellular respiration is no longer happening. Okay, and you're going to start to feel that burn because now your body is producing lactic acid. And that's what happens when you exercise. Your muscles are being depleted of oxygen.
I never knew that. I just always thought that meant that your exercise was working when it hurt.
Well, that it was good. Yeah, no, you want to feel the no, you definitely want to feel the burn. Yeah, you do.
Okay.
But this is cellular respiration is an aerobic process. We still need this oxygen to breathe. You know, oxygen is a requirement for us to breathe, right? And if you don't, if your muscles, if you're not breathing in oxygen, you're going to eventually pass out because your body is going to have too high of a acid content at that point. So we need the oxygen present. So in the absence of oxygen, so these organisms that are anaerobic, they don't have a requirement for oxygen, right, to survive. Oxygen can be lethal for these organisms. And so they had to have this, you know, physiologically, the body shifts into a different pathway. And in that pathway is fermentation when there's no oxygen present. So take home. Fermentation, in the absence of oxygen, glycolysis, so the pathway will start the same. We're still breaking down that glucose. We're getting our pyruvic acid. We're getting our 2 molecules of ATP being made from glycolysis. And then we shift into fermentation. There's no ATP produced during fermentation, okay? So let's look and see what happens. So we started this conversation off saying, how do organisms acquire the energy that they need? So we looked at 2 pathways today that compared how organisms that are prokaryotic and organisms that are eukaryotic get the energy that they need. So we start out with these glucose molecules that we're trying to break down, right? And these glucose molecules originate where, guys? Where does this glucose come from?
I know where it comes from.
Is it from the cell membrane?
Nope, don't think about it too hard. Just in general, like the big picture, like where does this glucose come from that we're breaking down, that our bodies
from food.
Right, from the foods that we eat. Okay, so we've consumed some food. We need to break this. We need to release the energy that's within this food. Okay, and depending on if these organisms are prokaryotic or eukaryotic, some things happen. Okay, the first step is always going to be glycolysis. All right, glycolysis happens out in the cytoplasm, doesn't have any requirements for oxygen or anything like that. So the glucose is first being broken down into the pyruvic acid. Glycolysis is going to give us our initial yield of 2 ATP molecules. Now, oxygen is our rate dependent, or our reaction dependent substance, right? So depending on whether or not oxygen is available or if oxygen is absent is going to dictate the final stages of breaking down this glucose. If oxygen is available, then we continue into the process that we call aerobic respiration, also known as cellular respiration. Okay, that process commences in the mitochondria. Okay, and we will have an overall net yield of 36 molecules of ATP at the end of breaking down 1 molecule of glucose. Conversely, if there's no oxygen available and we've gone through our glycolysis step and we've gotten our first 2 molecules of ATP, we've gotten our pyruvic acid made, but there's no oxygen available, then that pathway shifts into fermentation. Okay, where our products are not going to be ATP, but it's going to be either lactic acid or alcohol. That is what I want you to know from this chapter, this unit. So that's a visual. I like to do the same thing in text. 2 fermentation pathways here. Alcohol fermentation or lactic acid fermentation. Write that down. 2 types of fermentation can be the result of the anaerobic respiration, the absence of oxygen. Alcohol fermentation or lactic acid fermentation. Alcohol fermentation is going to produce that ethanol, all right? Organisms such as bacteria and yeast can undergo alcohol fermentation. Lactic acid alcohol fermentation is going to produce the product lactate. Lactate.
Is that milk?
During the anaerobic process, okay, when there is no oxygen present. Lactic acid fermentation leads to lactose, okay? This occurs in animals or other eukaryotic organisms. All right. And Nicole, you asked that question earlier about the fermentation processes. You guys have probably all heard about fermentation. Yes, that is how we make a number of foods and drinks that we consume, such as wine and beer and cheese and so forth, right? Different organisms can undergo fermentation. Aspergillus, that's yeast. Lactobacillus, that's bacteria. Saccharomyces are also yeast. So different, these are single-celled organisms, right? Remember those single-cell organisms, bacteria and yeast? Yeah, they undergo fermentation. And so we exploit them in order to produce these things that we consume on a day-to-day basis. So in conclusion, there's a pathway comparison here. You should definitely be able to compare what's happening during these pathways in the presence or absence of oxygen, okay? So we have aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is a cellular respiration process that requires oxygen, and it is utilized by eukaryotic organisms, and it results in a net yield of 36 ATP molecules per 1 glucose that we break down. On the other hand, anaerobic respiration leads to fermentation, okay, which is a process that does not require oxygen, and it is used mostly by prokaryotes, okay, single-cell organisms, which includes bacteria and yeast. But make sure you understand that yeast are eukaryotic, okay? They are a single-celled eukaryotic organism, though, so they don't have the same energy requirement. They're not very complex. And anaerobic respiration leads to a net yield of 2 ATPs per glucose. And so these are just some of the points of comparison that you should be able to make, again, about these processes of how organisms obtain energy. How do they obtain energy? What's the name of the processes? Cellular respiration versus fermentation. Where does it take place in the cell? You know, what are the end goals here? So this is just another schematic that I like when I teach this unit to compare respiration with fermentation. Okay, so the goal here is for us to be able to break down some of those organic compounds that we consume. And I showed you a slide earlier where we're talking about the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins. These are all substances that we consume as food sources. And so we want to break them down in order to get that energy that is stored inside of them. The first step in breaking down those compounds is glycolysis, all right? It starts with glycolysis, whether it's respiration or fermentation, okay? That glucose is broken down into a substance that we call pyruvic acid, okay? They're gonna yield a net production of 2 ATP molecules, okay? And then in order for that reaction to continue, we say, okay, is there oxygen available or not? Okay, if there's no oxygen available, then that pathway will proceed into what we call fermentation. Okay, and we looked at 2 types of fermentation: the lactic acid fermentation and the ethanol fermentation or alcohol fermentation. All right, if we start to break down glucose and there is oxygen available, so we make that pyruvic acid and oxygen is available, then the process continues as respiration inside the mitochondria, where we continue to produce our several units of ATP, 36, and also carbon dioxide and water are produced as a byproduct of cellular respiration. We're going to stop right here today. What questions do we have about this? Did I just hear? Did I just?
It's just a lot. Yeah,
It's a lot. I had made the announcement earlier, or the statement earlier. Let me stop recording now. That it's a lot of information.